come to Science 10, and increasingly as we've come into science, we've realized that our ignorance is truly astounding. And this is the normal condition at the end of the 20th century. In any field where the scientific consciousness has differentiated beyond the threshold of common sense, one has discovered increasingly that the reality which we live in and which we must respect has a strategy to it, and that its strategy is not common sense. And so we need to have some kind of alternative to common sense, not throwing common sense away, but reserving common sense as a kind of a sub-threshold sense of what's right, and we need now some kind of super-threshold sense of what's right, and not what's right in terms of right and wrong so much, although that is certainly applicable, but what's right in terms of what's real. And so the title of today's lecture is The Strategy of Reality, and the theme is to complement common sense, which sub-threshold is a very good guide, to complement that by something super-threshold, which traditionally in wisdom was called hermetic sense. So on one hand, you have common sense, which is good on the tribal level. But once one crosses over into a differential realm, into the differential side of reality, then common sense is no longer useful. And one must use, traditionally in the West, it was called hermetic sense. In the East Asia tradition, it was called Tao. And both the East Asia and the esoteric Western developed the science of alchemy to deal with the crossover from a realm where common sense applied to a realm where hermetic or Taoist sense applied. The difference is this, that integration, which is characteristic of nature, in the entire ecology of all the cycles of nature, integration holds. And integration refines itself by a direction motion, like in a journey. And that this direction motion, this journey, when it has a particular angle, an angle which in the integral cycle finally comes to an interiorization. That is to say, the journey not only takes place in nature and in terms of our body, but also takes place in terms of a languaging of that body and nature, and that language interiorizes to a mind. So that the journey has in nature, the integral cycle, has this peculiar kind of form. It always comes down to an angle of interiorization that focuses increasingly all of the different possibilities of direction motion, keeps factoring them in more and more until they become singular, until there becomes the particular angle, the particular direction motion within that angle, and it becomes the way, the path. Now, it isn't that there is an absolute, automatic, abstract path. It means that for you in this universe, in this nature, with the language that you use, with the body that is the protagonist in the journey that you take, with the way in which language interiorizes in your way, in your mind, that one comes finally to a singular path which is yours. And in this particular exactness, it's possible to say, like in any traditional wisdom education, you must find your way. If you do not find your way, then you are technically lost. If you follow someone else's way, you would have to be them for that to be real for you. And by assuming that you can follow someone else's way to this singular degree, to the extent that you believe that, you are deluded. And that the activity that you generate under that delusion is Maya, is illusory. Not that it doesn't happen, of course it happens. But because it happens in such a way that it does not integrate you in your specific way, but seeks to integrate you in someone's version of their specific way, you get a wobble, and that wobble, that vacillation, produces a kind of a chaotic reverberation. And so the integration is scrambled. And the more exactly you follow someone else's way, the deeper that integrates, the more chaotic is the wobble. Now, this is a very simplistic way of talking, and it's also somewhat illusory because it has a mental diagrammic aspect to it. Nevertheless, it's useful. It's useful because in a small scale understanding, a personal life in everyday terms is a small scale understanding, actually. Seems like it's awfully difficult, but it's actually very local. These approximations hold. It's like using Newtonian physics in terms of a baseball diamond. The bat and the ball, the players, are all going to obey Newton's laws of physics, and you can figure them out pretty accurately. If you're playing on a baseball diamond that's several galactic clusters wide, then the Newtonian view is going to be somewhat wobbly. Notice here that Newton's solution was correct for him. In his time, in his situation. His time is not just the late 1600s, but his, quote, time is the mental maturity of an early Enlightenment figure who, for reference, lived about the time his maturity came about the time that someone like Benjamin Franklin's father would have been born. So he comes a generation before Franklin. So we have this kind of a sense where the individual truth in integration is a function of increasing integration, and all the possible direction motions become factorable increasingly into a range which finally becomes an angle Now, sometimes it's called an angle of vision, but that angle of vision, that phrase, refers to a differential remembering process and actually is not in integration. The angle is not one of vision, but an angle of interiorization. It means that your experience, which is happening in nature, registers not only in your body, kinesthetically and physiologically, but registers also in the very language forms and feeling tones which you yourself as a sensitive, organic being feel and experience and have. And that as that language interiorizes, it develops this kind of angle of interiorization, and it means that all of the possible journeys that one could take, all the values of that are now factored into a narrower yet more powerful range of possibilities which are capable of being factored down to a single path, your right way. Now this is the nature of nature, that it allows for, it encourages, Mother Nature loves for integration to proceed, and apparently her love never falters because she loves integration to proceed down to where everything is able to collapse into a singularity. And this seems to be universal law. Now, it took a long time. It took almost 300 years after Newton for someone laying in their bathtub, a physicist, to realize that this universal principle extends also to not just the life of an intelligent, sensitive, feeling individual, but also extends to the natural life cycle of stars. Here's how it reads in a paragraph from one of our texts, Black Holes and Time Warps by Kip Thorne. He was a student of The Man in the Bathtub, and The Man in the Bathtub was John Wheeler, who was at Princeton for a number of years. This is his book, his biography, At Home in the Universe. They don't have a photograph of him here. Here's how Thorne writes how the idea of a black hole singularity as the final integration in the life of a star occurred, and occurred to this single individual in 1967. For those of you who were alive and conscious in 1967, you realize that the United States in 1967 was a very hairy place to be living. It was characterized, I think it was February of 1967, the New York Review of Books carried a full-page sketch by David Levine with Lyndon Johnson in caricature coming out of a hospital. We had an operation on his stomach. It was an appendix type thing, and the scar was in the shape of Vietnam. So that was the mindset of the United States in early 1967. So here's one of the world's greatest physicists who had worked on the atom bomb, who'd worked on the hydrogen bomb, who by 1967 realized that he had participated in a very strange way in a world which had come very close to oblivion. And these kinds of feeling tones in his angle of interiorization were there with him on a subconscious and also a conscious level. And it is Wheeler's habit to meditate about the names we call things when relaxing in the bathtub or lying in bed at night. He sometimes will search for months in this way for just the right name for something. Such was his search for a replacement for the name frozen star, which is what the Soviets called them. A star whose collapse into density reaches some kind of a threshold beyond which it cannot collapse any further, and it's frozen there. The other name for it, in quotes, is collapsed star. And Wheeler didn't like frozen star or collapsed star, and so he's lying there in his bathtub again and again trying to come up with a name. This seeking for a name, notice, is a primordial, mythic kind of activity. The naming of things is something that Adam does. The first man, by naming, makes the manifestation come out from a bodily limitation into a realm where it now participates in experience and is able to be interiorized and register in the mind. So that the name of something is always the first symbol. The most primordial of all symbols is the name. When one seeks to symbolize God, what's the name of God? Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction writer, one time, about 40 years ago, wrote a beautiful science fiction story of the far future when men and women would be so sophisticated that they discovered that there really are 9 billion names to God, and if one pronounced all 9 billion, one would get an answer. Back to Kip Thorne. So here's John Wheeler, one of the world's greatest physicists, lying in his bathtub trying to figure out what is the real name of what we misnomerly call a frozen star, a collapsed star. Finally, in late 1967, he found the perfect name. In typical Wheeler style, he did not go to his colleagues and say, "I've got a great new name for these things. Let's call them da-de-da-de-da." Rather, he simply started to use the name as though no other name had ever existed, as though everyone had already agreed that this was the right name. He tried it out at a conference on pulsars in New York City in the late fall of 1967. He was just giving this lecture on pulsars, and he just said the name, and attentive people in the audience picked it up, and it didn't quite register. Then finally he adopted it in a lecture in December 1967 to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, entitled "Our Universe, the Known and the Unknown." Now notice here that there's a threshold. There's always a threshold between known and unknown. What is known has been integrated in the mind, and what is unknown is as yet open and has not been integrated. In other words, is purely differential. And that the threshold between integral and differential, between known and unknown, can be symbolized by the name of something fundamentally pivotal. So here's strategic reality, John A. Wheeler, just beginning to use the right name that he'd come up with for frozen stars, for collapsed stars in the bathtub. Those of us not there encountered it first in the written version of his lecture, and then the written version, the transcript read, "By reason of its faster and faster infall, the surface of an imploding star moves away from a distant observer more and more rapidly." Like, that is to say, it moves faster and faster. It means it asymptotically gains speed. That is, every fraction of any time unit, no matter how fine you divide that into millions, into billions, into trillions, every fraction, it will move faster in a geometric way. The light is shifted to the red, that is to say, in a spectrum from red to blue, moving away, the whole light spectrum shifts into the red, and what happens with this kind of asymptotic collapse is that the red shift becomes permanent, becomes absolute. It becomes dimmer millisecond by millisecond, and in less than a second is too dark to see. That is to say, in the spectrum of visible light, which itself is a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. In the electromagnetic spectrum, visible light is actually very small parentheses, very, very small wavelength. And within that very small wavelength, it goes from infrared all the way to ultraviolet blue. And what happens with a distant observer seeing a star collapsing in this situation, the light shifts to the red and shifts out of the visible spectrum. No longer is there. No longer is visible. Becomes dark. The star, like the Cheshire cat, writes Wheeler, fades from view. One leaves behind only its grin, the other only its gravitational attraction. So that the Cheshire cat grin of this dark star is its gravitational attraction. That's all that's left. Gravitational attraction, yes. Light, no. No more than light do any particles emerge, because light is a particle. And the gravitational collapse is so intense that no light particles, no photons, can go against that pull. Moreover, light and particles incident from outside and going down the black hole only add to its mass and increase its gravitational attraction. So that anything that comes into its field will add to this. Black hole was Wheeler's new name. Within months, it was adopted enthusiastically by relativity physicists, astrophysicists, and the general public, in East as well as West, with one exception, in France, where the phrase trou noir had obscene connotations, and there was resistance there for several years. Typical Kip Thorne. The black hole is an ultimate integration of nature in terms of the life of a star. And stars, in terms of the universe, are like the basic cells that carry on the process of reality. In an organism like our cells, the cell is the basic fulcrum unit. It's about midway in size between the subcellular elements and the macrocellular elements, so that the cell becomes like a pivotal arbiter of the reality which we inhabit. And the cell in the organism has an analogy of the star in the universe. Stars are like the cells of the universe. So the life characteristics of a star, the life cycle of a star, is of immense interest to us. And the fact that a star has in its life cycle the ability to end up as a black hole it was a very upsetting thing 30 years ago. It was extraordinary. And the development of the implications of this have for 30 years shaken the entire field of science because it extends everywhere. Now we have, complementing our use of Kip Thorne's Black Holes and Time Warps, we have a book on the cell. Molecular Biology of the Cell, James D. Watson and 5 other authors. And one of the reasons of using Watson et al.'s book is that we began in Nature 2 years ago. We began in the Nature series of using the double helix, the discovery of the structure of DNA by James Watson. And so in a way, there's a kind of a parenthesis of the education. By starting with Watson's account in the early 1950s of discovering the structure of DNA, and 2 years later in Science, using Watson's textbook on the cell. Now, we could have used another volume by Watson, not just the molecular biology of the cell, but we could have used the molecular biology of the gene. Because before the molecular biology of the cell, there was an intermediate stage where the gene had to be understood in terms of a microbiological, that is to say, in terms of a super scientific differential analysis of structure. And indeed, in 1954, when the double helix came out, research was so frenetic, so frantic, so impelled by this discovery that indeed one could find a structure and understand this, that scientific labs around the world rushed into research. And within 9 years, a volume called The Molecular Biology of the Gene was published. This is the first edition of Watson's Molecular Biology of the Gene, 1965. The latest 4th edition is 2 big, huge volumes together about the size of the molecular biology of the cell. But when one looks at the way in which the molecular biology of the gene is symbolized, one sees a design on the cover. And if you turn this design on its side, you see the infinity sign. Because the structure of DNA, the double helix, if you take an episode of its continuity, if you take a subset, a cross-section of its characteristic structure, one will come up with the infinity sign. Now, if you have hermetic sense, if you're not working only with integration, only with nature, where common sense holds, but you've crossed a threshold of consciousness, so that now your appreciation for what is real not only takes in what can be integrated, but also takes in the complement to integration, which is differentiation, which has a whole different cycle. But that whole different cycle fits, dovetails, complements the cycle of integration perfectly, so that the two of them together form a whole. Out of this comes the phrase, the title of a book by David Bohm that was read a number of years ago, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. By wholeness, one doesn't mean the wholeness which is integrable, the wholeness of nature. One means the wholeness of the entire double cycle of reality. one portion of the pair of that reality is integration, for sure, is nature, for sure, is a realm where common sense holds, for sure. But the pair to that is a realm where Hermetic sense is a better guide. Hermetic sense in the direct aspect that wisdom traditions, East and West, have characteristically known and singled out this particular kind of differential structure is operating. And that the interpenetration of these two realms, of nature and what is beyond nature, of natural and supranatural, that the interpenetration of the two is being able to cross the threshold apparently both ways, a street that goes both ways, and that the science of this crossing of that threshold between natural integration and supranatural differentiation is alchemy. And so it's no great puzzle that both independently China and the ancient wisdom West developed alchemy. Now we know from Joseph Needham's great 20-volume study of science and civilization in China, we know that though the roots of alchemy were developed independently, East and West, that there came a time where there was an exchange of East and West that began very minutely with very skittish, rare contacts, and that those contacts began to develop somewhere around the 4th century BC, around 350 BC, about the time of Alexander the Great, so that one could characterize symbolically the beginning of a geometric development of alchemy East and West about the time of Alexander the Great, and that the world in the centuries following Alexander the Great, both East and West showed increasing interpenetration of influence. And that increasing interpenetration of influence facilitated the ability to understand reality in terms of a transformation from nature to supranature. If I use the term supernatural, it prejudices it. If I use the term which was used in those days, magic, it prejudices it. The fact is that the interchange between East and West in those days was largely through a land contact, and that the land contact between China and the Greek West was not through India, but was through Iran, and the wisdom tradition was always in the hands of people called magi. So that the term magic referred to Iranian wisdom and the development of a science of intercultural penetrative transformation was called magic because it belonged to this kind of realm. Both East and West looked towards an Iranian connection to develop this. The Chinese, as well as the West, thought this was the source. This is where it came from. Just as later in history, the development of alchemy in a larger sense, a more developed sense, came East and West through contact with a culture that developed and enveloped the Iranians, which were the Arabs, the Muslim empire. And so in what is our in our historical sense, the Middle Ages, alchemy developed in the Arabic language. And so both Chinese and Roman ideas of alchemy were influenced by the Arab language, Arabic. And it turns out that almost all stars that are named have Arabic names, because alchemy was seen as the focus of the earth in this transformation, whereas astronomy was seen as the beyond the earth sense of this transformation. So that alchemy on one hand and astronomy, which included astrology at that time, were both called Hermetic sciences. They were Hermetic sciences because they were the study of transformation between nature and consciousness, and back again from consciousness to nature. Now, the development from nature to consciousness is a transformation that's largely based in an internal sense. The locus, the pivot, the place where that transformation takes place is in the mind. The mind being the ultimate angle of interiorization, the ultimate place where that interiorization of all the directions, of all the possible journeys of nature and all of the integration paths that could be possible fold and increasingly become interiorized in the mind of a particular individual, and in your mind at its ultimate concentration is the path for you that you take for your transformation. With the understanding that someone else will take a very similar kind of strategy and come up with their particular path of transformation. That there is a coincidence that all paths of exact individual integration seem somewhat similar is just characteristic of the way in which nature as a whole and integration as a universal process seem to dovetail, which makes it more and more difficult for someone to tell whether they are on their own path or not. The more deep that one goes into an integration, the more deep that one goes into an interiorization, the less difference there is between your path and someone who has gone that deep before you. So it's very difficult to keep to the individual way. This becomes exacerbated, especially if someone is seeking to multiply the cultural situation of themselves and is choosing many different kinds of languages, many different kinds of paths, of saying, well, I'm going to become very multidimensional so that my integration is going to have more richness than anybody else's. That's wonderful, but it makes for greater problems at greater depth. So that traditional wisdom was always emphasizing it's better for you to go as deep as you can in one tradition than it is for you to try to go as deep as you can in many traditions. Now, from an integral standpoint, this is common sense, good wisdom. From a Hermetic standpoint, it is exactly the opposite. Because there's not only a tendency to not be able to tell the difference between your individual deep path and the characteristic deep paths of like world teachers whose path you are believing in. The Hermetic understanding is that there's danger that you will do your version of a belief which is subconscious. You will have interiorized that belief structure to such an extent that your path will be exactly your path because it couldn't have been any other way. It would have been prejudiced. It would have been preconditioned by assumptions which were characterized on such a deep fundamental level that you wouldn't have been aware of it. Because in integration, this consciousness, unless it's factored in, unless differential consciousness is factored into integration, integration more and more is like having blinders on, necessarily so, of concentrating and getting it exactly right. Good example of this is East and West. Individual meditators tend to become characteristically monastic. There are as many monks East as there are monks West. Someone practicing a yoga in New York and someone practicing a yoga in Calcutta tends to be more and more monastic and exclusive, because this is keeping integration home. If you factor differentiation into the process, one becomes aware that the preconceptions of monasticism obviate completely the development of an individualized path. Because part of what an individualized path is realistically is that you usually carry some kind of a gender characteristic with you, whether you implement it or not. Nevertheless, it is physiologically real. That is to say, in common language, monks ignore sexuality in order to have a more powerful concentration and integration. And yet, sexuality is not a cultural bias, but occurs in nature on the molecular level. And if cells have a sexual gender in organic organisms, which is there already on the molecular level before they even form, one is dealing here with universal structure that one has to recognize in a hermetic sense and factor into the common sense aspect of it, so that one can always tell a wisdom tradition that is real from one which is simply natural. A realistic community of human beings who are seeking for wholeness will have male and female populations at the same time. Such a kind of a community would have been characterized 2,500 years ago by Pythagorean communities. You never would have found a Pythagorean wisdom community of only men. When the Pythagorean idea was translated into Judaism in the 2nd century BC, it was factored into a cultural Mideast bias which had a masculine skew to it. And so the characteristic Jewish Pythagorean communities, like the Essenes, tended to be monastic in their composition. The community around Qumran was mostly men, almost always men. Yet one finds characteristically in more aware Essene communities that families cannot be prohibited, that marriages cannot be prohibited. Though not emphasized, it was nevertheless there. And so one finds that there is this adjustment where, as long as one is in a community like Qumran or some other Essene community, it's masculine in its tone, but in terms of outlier aspects of that community, families were at least tolerated. Yet when one finds Jewish Pythagorean integration carried to a transformation threshold, where the angle of interiorization exceeded the integral, crossed alchemically over into differential consciousness, one finds there that that kind of a community, like the Therapeutai community outside of Alexandria, had almost equal numbers of men and women. And that the characteristic use of differential language was that after the meditative meal that brought these two sets, these two groups of beings together, the culmination was a choral singing in which the male and female voices alternated antiphonically and contributed to a development of choral music, which later was misunderstood in the monastic West as plain song, as Gregorian chant, but has musically an integral which crosses over into a differential use of music quite adequately. One of my favorite albums of about 10 years ago was an Irish woman who was allowed to sing some Gregorian chant with some Irish monks, and they made a record of it. And when one hears the female voice, singular, in among the male voices, one hears almost automatically the antiphonal structure, which would not have been there had all the voices been either male or female. We need to take a break and we'll come back. And so you can see that the concerns of traditional wisdom, when applied to contemporary experience and thought, become such a swirl of possibility, and yet so tantalizing in offering little tabs of consistency, that the tendency increasingly in our time is to go for, or to approach, or to begin to prefer a kind of a metaphysic rather than an actuality. And this is very much a flaw. The difficulty centers around the fact that in nature, in the natural ecology, there are stable states which actually occur, and outside of these stable states, the occurrences tend to be unstable in the sense that they do not remain in an outlying configuration, but tend to integrate back into a stability. In the largest sense, the stability of integration rests in bodies, in actualities, in what we would call things or stuff, material structure. The most stable form of integration in the universe in terms of materiality is the proton. And even though the proton eventually has its life pattern, it's stable for billions of years. And just so, all of the forms that exist, the fact that this table exists, that this body exists, this book exists, the stability of existential bodies is a stable state. And we saw in our education, and we'll see again when we go back through the first year one last time next year, we'll see that the stability of the body is complemented by the stability of the mind, rather than complemented by, is paired with, so that the body and the mind are very stable together. They're stable states, they're stable phases that occur in an ecology. And just as there is like a pair of stable phases in that ecology, there are also a pair of stable processes. One could say that there is a stable state or a stable phase, and then there's a stability somehow in the interphase. And that the whole process of integration, the whole ecology of nature, has this kind of pair of pairs. We find, for instance, if we come to something, I've turned here to page 778 of Molecular Biology of the Cell. The chapter is on chapter 13, Cell Growth and Division. For cells to maintain their stability, they have to grow, and they grow by division, and they follow certain principles, and the phasing of the actuality of their physical reality goes through several stages, several phases. We read here, with a diagram on the bottom of page 778, of the cycle of cell growth and division, mitosis. The headline on this particular paragraph, metaphase and interphase, can be viewed as alternative stable cell states. And the language reads somewhat like this. A current hypothesis concerning the mitotic cycle is sketched in figure 13-64. It is, in a sense, a chemist view of mitosis, in which interphase and metaphase are seen as two alternative stable states the cell can adopt, with the other stages of mitosis being merely necessary intermediates in the transition between these two states. It is postulated that a single metaphase switch, single trigger switch, is turned on at the end of an interphase, causing the cell to pass through a couple of intermediate phases, prophase and prometaphase, to attain a more stable metaphase configuration. That is to say, a physiological configuration is a stable focus which is arrived at again and again, even though in a kind of an absolute way, if one looked at the infinity of possibilities, all the possibilities that there are, or that there could be, even factoring in imaginary possibilities, nevertheless, in that range, because nature has an integral preference, the infinite possibilities, including the imaginary ones, fold increasingly into this kind of focus where there is an angle of integration that reoccurs and most likely reoccurs. That is body's form. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're on this planet, Terra, or you're on Titan, a moon of Saturn's, or you're on some planet, say, in the Procyon star system, or wherever it is. Everywhere in the universe, integration holds. And its stability holds in characteristic elements, characteristic material. So that, for instance, the stable atomic state that we identify as hydrogen occurs everywhere in the known universe. Hydrogen is always hydrogen. If it has a variant of its structure, it's always deuterium, heavy hydrogen. And the most rare state of hydrogen, tritium, is always tritium, no matter where it is. So that geographic locale on a universe scale makes no difference to the registering of hydrogen as an atomic structure and recognizable. The same for oxygen, the same for carbon, the same for silicon, any of those elements. It's also true that certain principles obtain, like we were talking about before the break. Pairingness characterizes the way in which integration happens. Pairingness also characterizes the way in differentiation happens, but characteristically, differential pairs have a differential quality, so that we would say this. We come to a textbook published in Berlin in English language, The Molecular Basis of Sex and Differentiation. We come to chapter 4, which is about evolution divergency. And what do they have as a quotation at the beginning of this scientific book? They have a quotation from Kierkegaard about the nature of paradox. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist writer of the 19th century, fantastically accurate thinker, somebody who was able to take language and the way it interiorized into symbolization to an nth degree of integration, but also to factor a differential vision, a personal registering differential vision back into the symbolic integral analysis. And so he was able to write something like this about paradox, which is now quoted in a scientific monograph. The quotation, in translation from the Danish: "One should not think slightingly of the paradoxical. The paradox is the source of the thinker's passion. And the thinker without a paradox is like a lover without feeling." So that on the differential level, the registering of stability is in the person. What we've come to name, to call the person. It's a name that's been around for several thousand years. Perhaps somebody in a bathtub in Hellenistic times came to this kind of usage. It's a variant, it's an integral emendation of a more ancient term which meant mask, personae. The personae was the mask that someone wore, for instance, in Greek tragedy, or, for that matter, the pair to it, Greek comedy. The actor never showed their face in tragedy or comedy. They always wore a mask, and the masks were archetypally brought down to a pair where there was a smiling mask for comedy, there was a horrific frowning mask for tragedy. You've probably seen tragedy and comedy masks. These are the archetypal pairedness of masks, of personae. And those personae can be brought into play in any particular drama, which are then archetypally integral of all the possibilities of similar lifelike situations, and so on. Other than comedy and tragedy, which have masks, there is the possibility of something which is in between, which is paradoxical, which is neither tragedy nor comedy. And using the name that was consistent at that time of tragedy and comedy, the name for that alchemical intermediate that was neither tragedy nor comedy was mystery. And the whole drama of mystery was to reveal your face, not an archetypal tragic face, nor an archetypal comic face, but mysteriously, exactly, precisely your face, so that you would be able to discover by seeing the existential thing mysteriously who you were. Not the identity, this is a psychological misnomer, but the actuality. To see oneself. That self was called the person. So the personae are possibilities of your experience in various dramatic situations, which in terms of integral condensation come down to two possibilities, tragedy or comedy. Basic writer's motto, leave them laughing or crying, preferably both in the same production. And yet, in a deeper way, more serious writing tone is that there are always three possibilities, archetypally. There's comedy and tragedy, but there's also mystery. There's a possibility of someone seeing themselves exactly individually revealed to themselves in the production. In which case, in an integral fashion, it's important only that they recognize themselves. No one else has to recognize them, only they. So self-recognition was the archetype of mystery. And generally, if one gave a form to this self-recognition, the most archaic form of this was eyes that were completely larger than life, larger than nature. For instance, you might see used very frequently now in archetypal illustrations the mystery statuettes from ancient Sumer, where the figures are standing with togas, or in Greek they're called chitons, these robes that have these floral designs, abstract designs on them, means that they're made up in beautiful clothes for a very special ritual performance, one which includes not tragedy nor comedy, but mystery and the denouement of it, to use the Aristotelian term for the moment of discovering what the tragedy is. I guess we don't even have a name in English, but the Greek name for this of self-recognition of the moment where mystery reveals exactness was epopai, self-seeing. From this, we finally get the English name of someone who is able to see in this way as a seer. Someone who sees their own seeing in such a way that their own seeing sees who is seeing. This wide-eyedness, this owl's eyedness, one can carry it back even beyond Sumer, back into the archaic origins of civilization, and one finds that it is archetypally on the face of the mother. The great mother goddess of some 30,000 years ago always has these kinds of owl-like eyes. The paired, startled, dilated eyes that seeing itself and recognize the seer. That kind of a thing. The later classical Greek symbol of this are the eyes of the owl of Athena, which she wears on her shield. And if one looks at a classical Greek Athena, there's one here in Los Angeles at the Getty Museum, which occasionally they bring out a large statue about 7-8 feet tall. And if you look at Athena, the woman warrior, the woman inside the masculine warrior armor, the paradox of a woman in a warrior's armor. Her shield has the owl on the outside, and on the inside of the shield, where she holds this paradoxical mystery figure who is now no longer masculine exactly or feminine exactly, but is transformationally mysterious. The shield has a serpent coiled on the inside in an infinity sign, and she holds the shield by being able to hold that infinite serpent. That paired with the owl's eyes is the serpent's infinity. And one can see in the serpent's infinity body and in the owl's eyes, when you abstract them and put them there, you see the same symbol as one finds in the double helix, or the same symbol that one finds in modern chaos theory. Random attractiveness always has a double attractor mode. It generates this kind of butterfly effect, and one finally, if one runs a random pattern enough times superimposed, it will make closer and closer an approximation to this infinity sign. This is the hermetic order that comes out of even randomness, including all imaginary and all dimensional variance. The first mind to mathematically get an approximation of this was Leibniz, and Leibniz came out with the phrase that this is the best of all possible universes, which later was taken to task by Voltaire in the Enlightenment, where in Candide he makes Leibniz Dr. Pangloss, who was this naive optimist, that this is the best of all possible universes. Why are we kicked around so much then? Are we the best possible scapegoat for the universe? Is that how it's the best possible? But what Leibniz saw was that mathematically, what exactly happens increasingly is closer and closer to the reality, the truth. And if we can exactly be ourselves, that is the truth. That is the seer seeing exactly. In Wallace Stevens' great poem, about the woman walking along the seashore and singing, and the poet and his friend are standing up on this bluff, and they see her walking along, and she is singing, and suddenly it occurs to the poet in this flash of seeing, this wide-eyed epopta, he sees and says in the poem, "The sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, and she, singing, made." And he goes on to say, whatever theatrical amplitudes one has to take about the sea, whatever neutered, cold-eyed appraisal of the meaningless plungings of waves, nevertheless, when she sings there by the seashore, her song integrates and makes an angle of interiorization by which the sea, whatever self it had, becomes the self that was her song and she, singing, made. And were she able to carry her integration through to the mystery threshold, she would know that sea truthfully in relationality to her actual reality. It's knowable. It's discoverable. Perhaps not knowable so much in a grasping, but as in a discovery mode. Very often, integration in its more profound phases does not proceed by grabbing more, but by allowing acceptance to register deeper. It's called in some sophisticated meditative processes accumulated penetration. You let the actuality occur to you deeper and deeper. It actually comes from the old astronomical attention to stars, gazing at star fields. If you gaze at the same star fields night after night, year after year, for a lifetime, you get to see what's there. You get acclimated to the elements there. And after a while, one comes to see constellations of relationalities. This is the origin of the constellations. That's why we still carry that term constellation. Well, the ultimate alchemical seer, Zarathustra, from archaic Iran of 4,000 years ago, the name in Greek is stargazer. Zoroaster, star, and aster. We have the modern English word asterism, asterisk. An asterisk is an abstract point that indicates a notation of something further to be discussed. Stars, when seen in a field, opened up to an angle of integration, an angle of interiorization that allows for mystery to have a play so that self-recognition is a possibility, an operative. That accumulative penetration will begin to see the constellation, the further emendation, and one discovers always that you are included in the constellation. The seer is also a star that belongs in that constellation. That the alchemy of astronomy, being astrology, not so much the consulting of reference books on what this means, but of having the mysterious experience of being included in star field patterns You are then, as far as your body, as far as your mind, as far as your person, you are always and forever stable in the inclusion of that constellation. You are a part of that constellation. You carry that impress. Now, it's very easy to say this kind of language in a metaphysics, and it's completely imaginary. To say it scientifically is a completely different thing. One cannot use a mythic language. One cannot use an imagery referential language in order to speak in this way. It would lead to self-delusion on a grand scale, and the more that one integrated, the farther you would be. You would enter into a regression, as a matter of fact. And you would come out with a confidence in the very lowest level of ignorance. The lowest level of ignorance is ritual magic. Ritual magic is always the dunce chair level of understanding what's going on. Because consciousness is differential, and as it comes into play, it shifts the basis of the square of attention where integration and nature had their play. It shifts the base from nature to the process of vision, which is now in the forefront. So if you have a square of attention, imagine just for a second, nature 1, ritual 2, myth 3, symbol 4, as the quintessence, as the fifth essence, as vision comes into play, it displaces 1, nature. Nature, which was at the base of the progression, now is displaced by vision, which is at the forefront of the square of attention. So that consciousness is always looking ahead. Whereas integration always is referential back to nature. So that there's a complete transformation. It's like someone once said, of reaching inside of your throat, inside of your mind, and finding the center and pulling it inside out. It works completely in a complementary way, so that paradox is now characteristic of the way in which differentiation operates. If you look at integration initially in a paradoxical way, you end up with absolute skepticism. In fact, you end up ultimately with nihilism. You cannot begin with a skeptical attitude. You can conclude and be skeptical about this or that, but you cannot begin with it, because it progressively undercuts even the basis upon which there would be any traction. Classic example of this in Plato's Greece was a man named Diogenes, who went around naked in a barrel and was pessimistic and condemned everybody and everything for every reason. He called man a precocious two-legged biped who thinks he's real. There are aphorisms of Diogenes that were saved in classical antiquity, and they're collected. There's a translation that was made about 20 years ago. You cannot begin with skepticism. Every time you have a complementation of differential consciousness with integral nature, the two of them together form a kind of wholeness which cannot be characterized by integration alone, nor can it be characterized by differentiation alone. So if you cling to the tried, true physiological criteria for what exists, and the tried and true symbolic mentality of what it means, and you carry those perfectly workable, natural stabilities over into wholeness, you will always be involved in half-truths. Always. Which are the worst kind of lies. Half-truths are the worst kind of lies. Something that is really a lie can quickly be seen. Something that's only half true and half lie is very difficult to detect. It gets, in fact, when it's exact, when it's half, exactly half true, exactly half false. Neither integration nor differentiation are able to have any kind of applicability of discernment. This is why, like in the Vajrayana, in certain mystery dramas, there's a figure called the Gyalpo. The Gyalpo is a figure who is painted half white and half black exactly. This is like the blocky dead end of a non-distributive Tai Chi symbol. A Tai Chi symbol is interpenetrative. The circle of dark within the comma of light, or the circle of light in the comma of dark, are alchemically transformable and circulate. Whereas that circle drawn exactly half black, half white, when it resonates out larger circles that are half dark and half black, but quite the opposite, so that the dark half circle has a larger white half circle, and a further resonance would be a larger dark black circle, and the same for the other side, so that you would get this kind of false integration called a mechanical distribution of polarity. If you want to see an analysis of this sort of thing perceptually, Rudolf Arnheim, in Art and Visual Perception, has some discussion of this. In some of his later books, he goes into an aesthetic analysis of a symbol of transformation, some of his other writings. This kind of mechanical distribution of half-truths is not discernible from truth if one uses integration or differentiation by themselves. They both have to be brought together. It's like a two-handed affair. It's like two-eyed affair. It's like the complementation of the pairedness together makes it possible to tell reality from illusion. In the same way, organisms would not be able to self-select accurately for reality if there was not a gender pairedness. This has nothing to do with viability culturally of homosexuality. Nothing to do with that whatsoever. This has to do with the structure of the way in which organic forms register their ongoing reality. Now, if we come back to this chapter, just for a second, that has the quotation on paradox by Kierkegaard, that the passion of the thinker is in paradox. And if you remember in the symbols section of the course, dealing with the mind, dealing with thought, myth deals with feeling, symbols deal with thought, vision deals with intuition, ritual deals with sensation. That the passion of the thinker, this paradox, first occurs in a quality of symbols, where the symbol has a impaired capacity. The symbol can be an amulet or it can be a talisman. The symbol can continue to integrate and preserve and protect meaning as an amulet, but it can also broadcast out that meaning as in a talisman, so that it can continue to absorb meaning in an amulet fashion, or it can emit meaning in a talismanic fashion. A circle by itself would be an abstract universal amulet for protection. A circle which has reverberations around it would be a very good talisman for the differential power of projecting out the meaning. For instance, at the beginning of one of William Blake's greatest epics, Jerusalem, he has the seeker, the protagonist, entering into this cave, and the cave has an entrance that's shaped like a Gothic cathedral's doorway. And above the doorway is the phrase, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And he's carrying a light, and the light is not just a lantern that's in a sphere, but the sphere is like reverberating, so it has all these kinds of modifications of the sphere around it. It's like a spinning, living ball of light, which the seeker is carrying with him. He's going in where all of the hope that integration depends upon must be put into suspension. Because if you carried the structure of that hope with you, you would only see in terms of that particular binocular. You would only see in terms of those glasses. You would not see what was there. And yet, the threshold that one is going to, the transformation is going from nature to the underworld or to the overworld. From this world of nature to another world of differential possibility. And in order to make your way, you would have to be able to see whatever it was that was there, even though it was completely unknown to you, completely new. So that one of the fellow professors at Princeton at the time Wheeler was there, Stephen Tolman, who was in charge of science education in the United Kingdom for many years under the Neufeld Foundation, and made a whole series of little short films explaining science to grade school students. Became a very fine professor at Princeton and wrote a book on a new form of Locke's famous essay on human understanding. He said the old Enlightenment model of rationality was to be able to identify and pigeonhole any quanta of meaning so that one could plug it into known systems, and that was reason. That was rationality. Whereas the new model of rationality is to be able to start from scratch in an unknown field and to build up from the very participation that you have a relationality to the unknown, so that what comes out is a new model of rationality, an exploratory, creative rationality, rather than a plug into the schemata of a known template of order. So that rationality in the Enlightenment was known order applied to the unknown. The unknown was distributed into that old order, and one can now see that this was an illusion. It was a colossal illusion. Because one emphasizes more than perhaps any other place that somehow the rationalistic basis where modern science got its beginnings of a couple of hundred years ago was somehow the most rational state perhaps ever reached on the planet. And in fact, it was a massive delusion. Not for any metaphysical reasons, not for the normal reasons that are cited, people saying, well, it was a Western bias. It wasn't a Western bias at all. It was a world-class delusion that was entered upon around the whole planet. If one looks at the great rationalistic achievement of the Enlightenment, it was the development of the form that all knowledge can be factored into one super template massive form known as the encyclopedia. And in fact, the development of the Encyclopédie in France by Diderot was meant to be the archetypal sine qua non achievement of rationality. When we have an encyclopedia of all learning, we will then be able to apply this to whatever unknown comes up and to digest it. Whereas a scientific study of the actuality of making the encyclopedias shows this kind of thing. This is a quotation, The Business of Enlightenment, a book called The Business of Enlightenment, Publishing History of the Encyclopedia. It just took 25 years, 1775 to 1800. Publishers said what they pleased in their advertisements. The publicity for the encyclopedia, from the first prospectus of 1751 to the very last flyer about the Méthodique around 1830, is a series of half-truths, falsehoods, broken promises, and fake announcements about phony editions. The publishers lied so often and so casually that one wonders whether they ever considered honesty as a policy. It probably never occurred to them that they should feel responsible for keeping the public accurately informed. Indeed, the French state encouraged them to use false information in their prospectuses and title pages so that it could turn a blind eye to books that the clergy and parliaments wanted it to confiscate. So the entire age is characterized by a game of sleight of mind, which was carried out even on the highest, most comprehensive level. This is not to negate the Enlightenment, but just to point out how difficult it is for intelligence that is not whole, that does not have an in-depth, interpenetrative, complementary education, to be able to tell its own crazy, regressive stupidity from truth, even on massive cultural scale of European Enlightenment at its highest level. It is not a problem of somebody who's not very smart. Somebody who's not very smart doesn't get into these kinds of binds very deeply. They have other situations that come up. Naive trust that after having failed so many times, the probability is that you're going to be successful this time. That's a kind of low-level naivete. This is a more pernicious and insidious kind of situation that applies increasingly as one becomes more knowledgeable, which is exactly the situation that we have in an information explosion age. An age of supercomputers able to compute information and knowledge on fantastic scale so that one feels in possession of an encyclopedia of actuality and in possession of a method of application that certainly must be universally accurate, all of this is suspect. In fact, from the standpoint of a really advanced education, it's a delusion on colossal scale. Nightmare of imbecility, which cannot be heard, because the capacity to have ears to hear like that isn't there until it's really matured and developed. And that takes a lot of accumulative penetration for that to engender, and yet it can be done. It's not a question of there being some kind of shortcut way to do this, because shortcuts in and of themselves have their own kind of truncated regressiveness built in. The longest distance between two people is a shortcut. The traditional wisdom mode, going back a couple 100,000 years, is the shortest way to the center is to circumambulate the area, and to circumambulate it in a pair of ways. To go clockwise for a while and then turn and go counterclockwise for a while. And that by alternating this, one covers what would have been the mechanical distribution of integration and see through it. And you see that the circumambulation either way doesn't get you to the center, but acquaints you not only with the terrain so that you could find the center finally, but acquaints you with the wholeness of the situation, which allows for the center to occur. And generally, in that kind of disclosure wisdom education, you find that wherever it is that you are standing is the center, no matter where it happens to be geographically. That's the place where you could put the fulcrum of coordinates of understanding position. That was the achievement of Einstein in his theory of relativity. Wherever the thinker is in the universe is a trustworthy fulcrum for understanding all the rest of it in coordinates that include that person. We'll come back to that next week. Thanks.